Hi everyone, Raewyn here from WellWorks and welcome to Lifestyle Matters. This is the 10th installment and it is a beautiful day here in Mexico. And I've got Nathan joining me from England. Nathan is the medical director of WellWorks and he is a colleague as well as a friend. We've known each other for quite a few years now. I think we probably met back in 2011, so 10 years. And Nathan has got such an interesting journey. I wanted him to share it with you all because he is a medical doctor, but who was also sort of, I always say he's left the dark side and moved over into functional medicine. So Nathan, I'm going to hand over to you and get you to start talking a little bit about your journey and what brought you from traditional medicine and onto the path that you're on now.
That's great. Thanks for the introduction, Ray, and hi to everyone joining us tonight. Just by way of background, I am South African born, so one of a few Safas, I think, on the chat tonight. I completed my medical degree as well as a postgraduate honours in human genetics in Cape Town at the University of Stellenbosch, and essentially spent the formative part or early years of my medical career cutting my teeth on acute and emergency medicine. And I was really privileged to get incredible exposure back then to trauma care, infectious diseases, and a whole host of acute medical presentations. I moved to the UK in 2005, where I transitioned into more of a specialist advisory role within the corporate healthcare setting. And that's where Raewyn, our paths crossed as I was subcontracted to your ex-employer. So I've always been, as a clinician, drawn to innovations that leverage natural strategies and our understanding of human ecology to help to enhance human performance and improve, physiological resilience. And as I mentioned, rather serendipitously, we arrived at a similar crossroads in our careers. And WellWorks was subsequently born out of our shared desire to translate our interest in lifestyle medicine into strategies that will enable our clients to reclaim their health and thrive.
Was there a pivotal moment in your journey that kind of like catalyzed things? Was there something, I think we like to call it a Damascus moment. Did you have a Damascus moment?
A road to Damascus awakening. Well, look, very early on, way before I had my Damascus moment, so to speak, very early on in my career, I became acutely aware of the fact that a lot of the tools that I spent the better part of 8 years of training, acquiring, was really only effective at addressing a very, very small proportion of what I was being presented with through client presentations on a daily basis. And especially so at when I transitioned into a primary care general practice role, where I was usually the first point of contact in which would ultimately become a patient's clinical journey. I found that patients were often presenting with symptoms indicating a change or a loss of function long before they would present with symptoms indicative of biological breakdown, which is synonymous with disease. And as clinicians, we're generally only taught to interpret symptoms as signals of disease, but not really as signals of declining function. And it's often years of declining function, which of course precede a disease diagnosis. Fast forward though to my Damascus moment, when I came to the UK, embedding myself into a new culture, new geography. Very soon after I arrived in the UK, I actually became really, really ill. And that was on the background of one, being not in very good metabolic health, so being really overweight, unfit, but then also developed a respiratory disease on top of that. After I came out of the acute end of things, I decided, look, how do I construct a lifestyle where I am more resilient to disease, where I am metabolically optimized? And I quickly realized that none of the tools that I had were fit for purpose to establish that. And that's when I had to really, go back to first principles biology and first principles medicine and root cause medicine to try and understand, how do you leverage preventative measures before disease becomes commonplace? And I think for a lot of clinicians who find themselves who've had similar experiences, it's born out of having been at the patient end of the disease experience. So that for me was my Damascus moment.
And I think that's probably why you're such a compassionate doctor as well, because you have lived through a lot of what your patients are living through. And like myself, I actually came to see you when I was going through I was getting divorced. I was on tons and tons of medications at that time, just antibiotics over and over and over. And I remember when you looked at me at one point, you said, well, maybe you need to start thinking about healing your gut. And I was like, what does antibiotics have to do with healing my gut? And that's kind of like one of the sparks that you planted a little seed for me. And I started going down that rabbit hole of well, what are the foods that I'm eating? How are they impacting how I feel? And I know that a lot of people who have joined this call, they've had a very similar experience as well. They've encountered someone or some sort of clinician who's asked them to just start thinking about something a little differently rather than, take a pill to match this symptom. So it's interesting that your journey it's been personal, and that's why it's been so transformative. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of put you on your mission led now. You're not just about practicing, standard medicine where you're like, oh, someone comes in for 10 minutes and you hand them a script and then they walk out the door. You and I spend a lot of time with our clients. We spend hours, over the course of 6 months trying to get them back to a place of restoring function. Now, I want to touch on something that you brought up a little while ago where, the subclinical versus the clinical, because a lot of people come to us after they have seen clinicians and, specialists and have run lots and lots of different tests, but everything comes back as being clear or they can't find anything. Can you speak a little bit about that and why that would be?
Sure. Let me preface, I guess, that answer first by saying that we know that humans don't exist in a binary state, of either being diseased or healthy. Or if I can flip that around, being healthy or enjoying optimal health is so much more than just the absence of a disease endpoint or a disease diagnosis. And unfortunately, the reality for a lot of people who engage with the medical industrial complex, as I like to call it, come away from those interactions with, quite often, if they don't meet a diagnosis threshold or diagnostic threshold of disease, they are sent away quite often with false reassurance that, look, you don't feel well, you don't have a disease, but we'll kind of just keep monitoring and see what happens over time. So what the medical fraternity is kind of generally good at is intervening in a very structured way when breakdown has happened to a point that amounts to disease. And at any point before that, if we don't have the language or the nomenclature to accurately define what's wrong, we revert to watchful waiting. So we wait and we monitor, which is ultimately just an exercise in meticulously documenting serial decline. Until you cross that inflection point. And the sad thing is that as humans, we can adapt very quickly to feeling suboptimal. If you ignore signals of dysfunction for long enough, what is suboptimal becomes your new norm. You forget what it feels like to actually function at an optimal level. And then we actually lose out, on the opportunity to intervene and reverse declining function before it crosses that disease threshold, unfortunately.
I think that's what I find so powerful about what we do now, because we really do kind of nip things in the bud rather than waiting. That wait and see approach, I don't know how that's really helpful, because, then someone is stuck on medication after being, if you wait and see, wait a year, 2 years, and then you're a lot worse off than if you had nipped it in the bud to begin with.
Well, waiting and seeing means you're expecting one of two outcomes. you're expecting that something is going to magically disappear, on its own, or you're expecting that it will progressively deteriorate. And if we're saying that most things, most medical conditions at least, once they start, or once the wheels of dysfunction are set into motion, it tends to be a progressive process. There is no intrinsic point at which things just magically improve, without the necessary intervention. So unfortunately, watchful waiting and, just meticulously checking things every 6 months or every year is often a counterproductive exercise.
And in lots of ways, a waste of resources. If
Absolutely.
you think about it, it's not really actually moving the needle on health. It's just, we're just tracking it until we can start prescribing you something, rather than, okay, well, what are the factors that are driving these symptoms? So I remember for myself, like I had seen a gastroenterologist she looked at me and she said, there's nothing structurally wrong with you. I'm like, yeah, but lady, I can't leave my house. It takes me 2 hours to get out the door because I'm in the bathroom and in pain and doubled over and cold sweating. And, I'm not sleeping, or I'm waking up with panic attacks. Like there's something wrong. Like even if it's structurally not wrong, something's wrong. But she had no solution. And like you said, like that language just doesn't seem to kind of be present, or the tools. I think it's more tools, not just language. It's just not in their toolkit to kind of deal with, well, there's some inflammatory cascade that is happening right now. And the symptoms are sort of like by the time they appear, something's already been going on for quite a long time. And I think that's the bit that traditional model tends to miss. So how can we be more proactive, by folk, the title of this event tonight is Self-Care as Healthcare. So what are some of the tools and tips and tricks that we can put in, well, not tricks, but strategies and lifestyle measures that we can implement that will actually help us move that needle on being proactive and on getting ahead of some of the chronic health conditions that we tend to see a lot of, which, the top 3 I could think of is just obviously respiratory illnesses, gut health, IBS, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and then hormonal things. Women are dealing with a lot of those. What are your sort of recommendations around that?
Firstly, I think be persistent with your curiosity. Really trust your body's signaling. I think too often, especially as it pertains to non-specific symptoms, so things like fatigue, headaches, digestive ills. Most clinicians find those types of presentations really hard to frame diagnostically within a 10 or 15-minute consultation. And quite often people are sent away with false reassurance, but still, as you illustrated in your experience, still suffering symptoms which are worrying and also disruptive in terms of their quality of life. But be persistent. If something changes and is functioning differently and is impacting on your quality of life, if you get turned away from one door, go to a different GP, go to a different clinician, because at some point, either someone is going to take your presentation seriously and support you in the way that is required. The alternative is that you're sort of going to be left to your own devices and then have this period of 10, 15, 20 years where we really lose the opportunity for meaningful intervention. So trust your gut, be persistent. And as is said quite often in the English parlance, don't accept getting fobbed off by just everything's okay. Secondly, I would say test. Right, so you can only manage what is measured. Is kind of one of my key kind of views in life. So. And I think maybe here would be a good point, Ray, just to maybe talk about the differences between conventional diagnostic testing versus functional health screening.
Thank you. You took the words out of my mouth because that's where I was going to go next. So explain the difference between the traditional, like what your doctor will do versus what we will do in the functional space.
Sure. So when you go for a conventional blood test, the results of those tests are interpreted within a framework of an abnormality that links up with disease, right? So that's point number one. Having said that, for an abnormality to be present in your blood work, it usually means that the degree of abnormality is hugely significant, or it's been there for a significant period of time, because the one environment that the body will try and keep stable and maintain equilibrium at all costs is the blood. So quite often when you do a blood test, and if I can maybe illustrate this in an example, let's take iron levels. So people often get tested for iron levels. You can have normal iron levels in your blood and be completely deficient at tissue level where iron is used. So that's a way, an example of where a conventional blood test might not be indicative of the functional picture at tissue level. So if you do, it's not a bad place to start. But if you come away from having a conventional blood test done and you are still experiencing significant symptoms, we need to ask more questions. We need to be doing functional testing and testing that looks at essentially breakdown in function at cellular or tissue level.
All right, that's really powerful. Some of the things that we like looking at, because a lot of people sometimes don't understand, like, well, why do we have to do a stool test? And what, and how does that impact, what's going on with my hormones? Like, what does having a gut health test have to do with my hormones? Do you think you could talk a little bit about that too? Like why we find that important for us? Because a lot of what we see is linked to, poor digestive absorption. So it's not just what you're eating, but how well you're absorbing and converting, and how that is translating into, neurotransmitter production. So how your brain's functioning, or hormonal production, how your hormones are functioning, your thyroid. Do you think you could talk a little bit to that?
So there is, in functional medicine, central to a lot of what we do and a lot of the ways that we approach disease and human performance has to do with what's happening in the environment of the digestive tract or the gut. And the reason for that, quite simply, is because the human digestive tract is the largest interface between ourselves and our environment. It's that interface is an orders of magnitude larger than our skin surface or any other interface. So the area or the interface or where our environment most impacts and interacts with our physiology, our performance, and ultimately our well-being will be the area of the gut or the digestive tract, so to speak. So that's a key area. When it comes to functional diagnostics, instead of, when we look at higher order manifestations of gut disruptions, quite often hormonal issues, skin issues, autoimmunity, allergies, neurological conditions, those can often be, not exclusively, but can often be, second or third order, higher order manifestations of disruptions that are happening at that interface between ourselves and our environment, which is essentially the digestive tract. And that's why that's such a key area of diagnostic investigation within functional medicine. Great
that you brought that up, because some of us have gone through scans like endoscopies or colonoscopies, or we've had stool tests with the NHS or even with private GPs, but the difference in the functional work, I'm trying to figure that out, because someone asked me earlier today, a lady who's actually on the call, actually, I can see her now. She said, I'm a scientist and I want to know, like, what are the solutions? Why is this different to what I would have done already? And what's the solution that you put the poop in? Sure. Like, what is it made up of? And what are you looking for?
Yeah, so conventionally, if you went to a gastroenterologist or a colorectal specialist, they'd be looking at the anatomical structure of the digestive tract to see if there's any change in structure. But you can have changes in function before you have visible changes in structure. And a good way of understanding that is you can have a tire with a slow puncture that still looks like a tire. Okay, but a tire with a slow puncture functions very differently as a tire that is holding air and functioning normally. So looking at it from a distance, they both look like tires. but they function very differently. Okay, and I think that's the difference. A colonoscopy will tell you whether structurally your bowel and your digestive tract looks healthy, but it won't tell you how your digestive tract is functioning and whether there are factors at that interface between ourselves and our environment that are negatively impacting on our function and our overall health. It will not tell you that.
And the GI map, which for me was life-changing because I had been through numerous gut health tests with the gastroenterologist and my GP. But when I had done the GI map, that's when I had known for years. I was like, I know I have a parasite, and everyone kept saying, "No, you don't. You're being silly. There's nothing there." And then when I did the GI map, that's when you got a parasite, plus a bunch of other fun things because of biofilm, like all these things collect together. So once you got one, you tend to attract lots of other ones because the overgrowth of the bad bugs, they crowd out the good bugs, and then your body can't function very well and your immunity goes down. And like you were just talking about skin conditions, migraines, brain fog, all these things are linked to poor functioning digestion or poor functioning or dysbiosis or overgrowth of pathogens or leaky gut.
Sure. Well, let's I guess to make that a bit more concrete, let's take a very, very common hormonal condition like an underactive thyroid gland or hypothyroidism. So hypothyroidism is a metabolic condition which is characterized by insufficient production of thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone is the master metabolic hormone in the body. Without thyroid hormone, nothing happens, essentially. Now, 70% of cases of hypothyroidism is driven by autoimmunity, by an actual autoimmune destruction or reaction against the thyroid gland. And we know that in the vast majority of cases, an autoimmune process is triggered by a dysfunctional immune response that can be traced back to some issue in the digestive tract, quite simply because that's where 70 to 80% of your immune cells are located at any given time. And I think this illustrates the difference between a functional approach to diagnosis and the more sort of conventional approach to diagnosis quite well. 1 in 20 people who are diagnosed with hypothyroidism will essentially just be told that for whatever reason, they don't have enough thyroid hormone. So for the rest of your life, take some thyroid hormone. Okay. But what's not happening is, them trying to get an understanding and being assisted with, well, what's driving this underproduction? Could it be autoimmunity? If it is autoimmunity, why is my immune system doing this? Why is my immune system attacking my thyroid gland? And to understand that, you need to look at the environment where immune cells spend the majority of their time, which again is the gut.
And that actually is amazing because we see so many people showing up with anxiety or with depression or with fatigue. Some of these things, like you said, like they seem a little bit vague and you're like, they're not necessarily always connected. Skin health, migraines, brain fog, but no one ever sort of like looks at, and I see a lot of women coming my way and they're being put on medications like antidepressants or anti-anxiety meds, psychopharmaceuticals very quickly, but no one ever looks at, what's your thyroid doing? What are your B vitamins? What's your B vitamins like? Those kinds of things. Like no one's checking mineral status.
Absolutely. And I think that's because hormone imbalances in general tend to present in really diverse and complex ways. And you just touched on something as simple as, hypothyroidism or underactive thyroid gland might present with depression or might present as anxiety or might present with heartburn, or skin changes, hair changes, libido changes, So my rule of thumb generally has been the more diverse an initial set of symptoms are at presentation, the more likely it is that there's some kind of hormone etiology in play at some level.
Okay, I want to actually open the floor up for people to ask questions. So I'm guessing you guys can all see the chat feature. We've got about another 5-10 minutes. I usually keep these very brief because I like people to go and have an evening. I don't believe that we should all be on our devices for very long, because one of my mantras is rest for success, and sleep and recovery and rest are the biggest healers. So for the next sort of like 5 to 10 minutes, I just want to open it up to questions from the room or the group. And if you want to pop your questions in the chat feature, Nathan and I will see them and we'll take them now. Nathan, by the way, this has just been so insightful. I'm guessing everybody else is finding that too, because it's answering a lot of questions on my end. Some of the things that I had knowledge gaps around, and I'm hoping that it's filling in some knowledge gaps for the people in the room. So guys, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat feature, or raise your hand if you want to. Would love to take questions from you. I know a few of you were very curious about, how it is how this is different to some of the things that you've done in the past, or what you might currently be doing with a traditional doctor. Carmen was one of them. She and I chatted at the start of the week, and she's going through quite a few things.
Sorry, just to, Ray, if I may, and this might help frame, some of our participants' questions. Just back to how, the issue of how functional testing, again, is different. And I'll use hypothyroidism again as an example. Symptoms of hypothyroidism can often precede derangement in blood levels by up to 10 years. So you might have symptoms and still have blood levels which fall in the acceptable range for a period of up to 10 years, as it pertains to hypothyroidism. And where hypothyroidism is mediated by an autoimmune disease, those autoimmune antibodies can precede symptoms by another 5 years. So stuff might be going wrong for 15 years before you actually realize that, before they manifest as symptoms. Yeah. So again, that just points out the value in getting a functional diagnostic handle on symptoms, and not waiting for your symptoms to be validated by a derangement on a blood level.
That's a really interesting word too, derangement on a blood level, like waiting until things really get out of control, taking action now. And again, prevention, way better than cure. So Charlene's asking, it would be lovely to have some real strategies, particularly at the beginning of the journey, as you mentioned, your own health. Could you detail the steps that you took? I'm guessing, is that directed to Nathan or to me, Charlene? I mean, I can answer on my end, and then we can get Nathan to answer. But Nathan, maybe you should just go first. What are the steps that you took?
Well, the first thing was, and I know this is quite a broad answer, but it's cleaning up your diet. Because again, the biggest environmental exposure you will have, and the most impactful environmental exposure you will have, is essentially what goes at the end of your fork, right? And what goes into your mouth. And trying to keep that as clean and unprocessed as possible, just as a departure point, is essentially key. So, for me, I spent my teens and early 20s living on convenience food, refined sugars, foods just laden with preservatives, etc. And all of those things over time cascade to cause, quite severe disruption in the health balance and the balance in your digestive tract, which then is quite a potent and powerful precursor to a number of disease manifestations. So just doing something as simple, just cleaning that bit up, cleaning up, like I said, that environmental exposure. There's a lot of environmental exposures we have no control over. We have no control over, environmental pollutants, toxins, etc., exposed on a daily basis. But what passes and what enters our mouth, that to a greater degree, we do have significant control over.
I totally agree 100%. I think sometimes though people have a perception of what they think is healthy and what might be, that expression, what's one man's meat is another man's poison. Yeah. I am a big advocate in testing because I thought I was healthy when I was experiencing all of my health issues. I was eating low fat because that's what the doctor had told me to do, because she said my cholesterol was high. Even though I was working out all the time. So I was eating low fat. I was eating a vegetarian diet as well. And And that definitely did not help. So I think it's very important to be personalized. So in terms of a strategy, test, don't guess, get very personalized with your nutrition, because you might be eating aubergine and actually it's causing your psoriasis and your joint pain, because nightshades are one of those things that people who've got issues like psoriasis or joint pain cannot eat or should not be eating or consuming. So you need to figure out like, okay, well, what are the foods that are triggering some of my reactions? Because there might be some food triggers there as well. Gluten is another one that, was told like, oh, you don't really have any real problems with it. But when I've done like DNA tests, I've got genes for celiac. My dad's got celiac. He's got psoriasis as well. And that those two are comorbid. They go hand in hand with each other. And I'd had a lot of issues with my skin too. So which is why I really am a big advocate. It's like, yes, definitely what's at the end of your fork, clean it up, remove processed food, remove sugar for sure. I don't believe that people should all be vegans or vegetarians. I think it works for some people. It doesn't work for others, which is why testing is important.
On that point, right, I've lost count of the amount of people, and again, this is not criticism of a vegan lifestyle. It has its merits, but for someone, I've lost count of the amount of clients I've dealt with where they've changed from eating a full and unrestricted diet to a vegan diet, and that has triggered a whole host, a cascade catalog of problems, just because they are not adapted to extracting all of their required nutrients from plant sources only. So yeah, as you say, it's a very individualized thing. It requires individualized testing and personalized testing. And what works for one person won't necessarily be optimal for the next.
Yeah, 100%. Charlene, does that answer your question? Does that help? Because we talked about cleaning up the diet, and then we talked about personalizing it as well. That's probably one of the two biggest steps that you could take, personalizing and cleaning it up so that you know exactly what you should and should not be eating, and what you might be deficient in as well. Like that's one of the other reasons we recommend like lab work, because our type of lab work, not the traditional type of lab work, because it does give us clarity on, okay, I know exactly what goes into my body is actually what should be going into it, and what will actually help build it up. Because a lot of the things that we're surrounded by, like Nathan said, they're kind of designed to break the body down, right? So, and what we have to think of is like, well, whatever I'm engaged in doing or eating or consuming, or, is this something that is going to help create health, or is it something that's going to be detracting from health, right? And I know health is not binary, but pretty much everything that we're doing on a daily basis will have an impact on our psyche as well as our biochemistry. So Michelle wants to hear about sleep strategies. That's a whole other talk, but but I always say rest for success. Absolutely. I mean, I touched on that a little while ago. Let me see how we can kind of break that down into like 2 or 3 simple steps. Getting to bed before 10 p.m., very vital. Turning off lights, not just dimming them, turning them off. If you've got a red light, that's one of the things that we love using with clients. So yeah, turning off lights, getting into bed at 10 p.m. What are some of the other things? And if you can't, so Michelle, is this because you can't sleep or you are struggling to stay asleep? Okay. So, all right. So that's an HPA axis dysfunction thingy going on right there.
Sure. Ray, if I may, the 2 key things I have found really useful and beneficial just to regulate that sleep-wake cycle for me is trying to get natural light exposure as early as possible or soon as possible after waking first thing in the morning. So because that sets, you've got a forward setting mechanism which determines at what point your body's going to start making sleep hormone 10, 12, 14 hours later in the day. And for a lot of us, our first light exposure is from junk light, right? So it's either from junk light from a light in the room, artificial light, fluorescent lighting, blue light from our phones, as opposed to, natural light or natural sunlight. Now, I know in certain geographies like the UK, there are, long parts of the year and huge parts of the year where you just don't get good quality natural light till later in the day. And that's why I find things like red lamps or near infrared lamps can be quite useful to mimic that exposure to natural sunlight first thing in the morning. The other thing is I swear by wearing blue light blocking lenses from 6 o'clock or from sunlight from after a sunset. Sorry. So yeah, I've made the exception for this kind. I just didn't want to weird anyone out with wearing red lenses on this call. But normally by 5-6 o'clock in the evening, I'm wearing these and completely reducing my exposure to blue light from not only screens and devices, but just light bulbs in general. And you can get glasses which effectively reduce blue light exposure, blue and green light exposure by up to 90%. Which is hugely beneficial for making sufficient amounts of melatonin so that you actually have good restorative sleep architecture.
Fantastic. I just want to add one other thing to that too, because I know light is a huge factor when it comes to sleep, but also I know a lot of people tend to have worrying thoughts, like when they try to get to sleep, their brains just don't want to shut off. So you can have a ritual in place where you just a behavioral thing where you sit down and you actually write and either journal things that have happened throughout the day, but focus on gratitude and things that have gone well, and starting to train your brain to like actually just disconnect from screens. And then the physical act of writing, pen on paper, that's actually very, very calming and restorative. So that's something that I think works really well for my clients with anxiety and with sleep issues.
Our brains respond well to cues, right? So, that's a cue for unwinding and shutting down. So
exactly. So gratitude journaling before bed, and disconnecting from devices from about 8 p.m., 7 o'clock if you can, turning them off. If you want to watch some TV and something that's relaxing, definitely do that. But please don't watch anything like a horror film or something stimulating or get into an argument with your partner. You want to try and avoid anything that's going to start elevating your cortisol, because cortisol competes with melatonin, and cortisol is that stress hormone, and it's meant to taper off in the evening. But some of us go and exercise late in the evening. Bad idea for helping boost melatonin production, because all you're doing is boosting cortisol production, and that sucks up all your melatonin. So you want to not work out late in the evening. In fact, you probably want to stop working out. Anything high intensity, latest is like 5 o'clock. Do not go for a long ass run, at 6 p.m. and think, oh, I'm doing myself a favor, right? If you're going to do anything, more restorative practices. So that's why gratitude journaling, it's a very restorative practice. Some stretching, some breath work, dimming your lights. Dimming the lights has a big impact on hormones as well, on female hormones. And I don't think a lot of women are aware of that. By being exposed to junk light and overhead light, that disrupts our hormones. So if we want to start bringing our bodies back into balance, light is really important, but also these restorative types of practices are going to be very, very vital for improving our overall health. I hope that answers your question. But yeah, she says it's been fantastic. Never thought to do it before bed. Yeah, gratitude journaling, a good place to kind of start before bed. Any other questions? Because we're up to time. So I would take one more, and then we will say thank you and good night to Dr. Nathan, who is working very hard to keep the nation safe. But you're working in a COVID ward. Like, that's a big deal.
You're very kind, right? You're very kind. Thanks for saying that. You
stayed healthy throughout the entire thing, despite being exposed all the time. And I feel like that's something we could do another talk on. Like, exposure does not necessarily mean you're going to become diseased, but that's a whole other topic.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So I feel like this is a to be continued, because I think a lot of cool things have come out of this. Oh, trying to heal gut inflammation.
I've got one more.
Yeah. And this, again, Megan, this is where I go back to testing and not guessing. You have to figure out, like, I personally don't do yoga for exactly that reason, because dairy and I are not friends. And it has a lot of hormones in there. So unless you know exactly where your cows are being farmed and you know what's going into them, the hormone disruption, like what your animals are eating, is basically what you're going to be eating. What they're being exposed to is what you're exposed to. Nathan, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's about personalizing and individualizing the testing. You need to know what your individual and personal triggers of gut inflammation are. One person's triggers are going to be completely different from the next person. And you're right in saying that, as it pertains to animal products, whether that's dairy, meat, what have you, they all carry either an anti-inflammatory or pro-inflammatory signal. And that signal comes from whatever that animal was fed. So with dairy, it will always be, if it's conventionally farmed or sourced dairy, that's always going to be a pro-inflammatory signal. There's just no way around that.
Thank you for clarifying that. So one last question. Do your triggers change over time? I'll let you take that.
I think so. What the digestive tract is very good in doing is modulating your sensitivity to a given trigger. So a healthy microbiome, balance of good versus bad bacteria in the gut, will make you less sensitive to the inflammatory impacts of a given trigger. So the way you look after your gut and the way you look after your microbiome can determine whether your gut bacteria and your microbiome serves to buffer you against inflammatory triggers, or actually reinforce and amplify those triggers. So it's very much a question of, yes, your sensitivity to triggers of inflammation can change, but that is largely modulated by what's happening in your gut.
Thank you for that. I hope that answers everyone's questions. And if there aren't any more, it's coming up to 1:15, and we are going to say goodnight. And for those of you who don't know, like if you are having trouble with sleep, I do have a hypnosis recording because I trained as a hypnotherapist, in case you didn't know that. So I do have a hypnosis recording that you can download from the website. Michelle, I will send it over to you if you want that, but I will just also put it in the chat for anybody who has not got it yet, because I think, here we go, download MP3. That will help with people who want to get back to sleep. It's usually very, very helpful. Okay. So everyone, thank you for joining. Nathan, thank you so much for being so gracious and for sharing your time with us. Like I said, I think this is a to be continued. I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, absolutely. I found that thoroughly enjoyable. Thank you very much for having me.